So welcome to the second in our series of Lenten lectures, study group, discussion, however you want to term it. The Reactive Church is the title of this whole series. And each week we try to look at an event in the history of the world which was not instigated by the church, but it's something the church had to react to. The action today is the shift of power from the Roman Empire West to the Roman Empire East. The decline of the city of Rome, the building up of the city of Constantinople. It doesn't really seem like that dramatic of an event, and truly it took 100 years, really. You don't build a city quickly, nor do you change an empire overnight. But in the 4th century, early in the 4th century, things started changing. Christianity up until this point had been mostly illegal. There were times where it was actively persecuted, and then there were times when it was not so actively persecuted. But in the year 306, in the city of Trier, here in Germany, Constantine, son of Constantius, son of Helena, was declared to be Roman emperor. There were times when he shared this throne with others. There were a tetrarchy at times. Sometimes he shared it with another, but he was eventually going to become the sole Roman Empire. And it was a real turning point, as we know in the history of the church, because it was under Constantine that Christianity was first made tolerated and secondly made legal. Constantine's mother is worthy of a side note. Do you all know of Saint Helena? I mean, I think she should probably be the topic of every Mother's Day sermon. She is that relentless mother who would not give up on the salvation of her son. Now, she was the Dowager Empress, so she wasn't just any mother, but she constantly badgered him into becoming a Christian, something that he always said he wanted to do, but he was worried that being an emperor and being a Christian may be contradictory to such a degree that he would lose his salvation if he violated his baptismal vows. Helena entered into a time of great grief when her favorite grandson, Constantine's son, and Constantine's wife both found themselves executed at Constantine's order. It's not exactly clear why they were executed, but Helena went into a deep grief and set out on a pilgrimage to try to console herself and ended up in Jerusalem, where she is said to have had a dream and discovered the place where the true cross of Christ had been buried. And she had her entourage come and the soldiers with her, traveling as Empress Dowager. She had a lot of hands and shuffles at her disposal, and they dug this up, and sure enough, there was wood there, which now is scattered all around the world as pieces, relics of the true cross. My seminary professor was a little bit skeptical of this, as seminary professors tend to be. He said there are enough pieces of the true cross that if you put them all back together, you could build Noah's Ark. Well, Helena did more than just dig things up. She also located the places where Jesus's life had taken place, and she had built at the emperor's cost grand churches, which are still there. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Church of the Holy Nativity, all of these places you visit when you go to Jerusalem, they tend to date back into the 4th century and the patronage of St. Helena. But St. Helena and Constantine started at the time when Rome was already in much of a decline. The city's infrastructure was just rotting and falling apart. It was already 400 years old. The streets had never been maintained. The buildings were falling down, and there was little ability to fix it. The tax base of the city was non-existent, and the rich people had all built their houses out in the countryside, and the plebs Romanum were just suffering a terrible thing, and it wasn't a city that was worthy to be capital of such a great empire. This wasn't because the Huns and the Goths and the Visigoths had come to destroy them. That would come later. But Constantine actually declared emperor in Trier. Trier was acting at that time as the Roman Empire's capital city. From Trier, it then went to Arles in 418, and Ravenna was built also as an alternative to Rome, just because Rome was just practically uninhabitable for the upper classes. Constantine's idea was that he wanted to build a new city in what he considered the best part of the empire, the place where the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea come together. And so he chose the small Greek village Byzantium, and he renamed it Constantinople, a very humble act to name a great city after oneself. But I suppose there aren't that many Roman emperors who were ever considered to be humble. He took quite a while to construct the city, and it remained as a capital city for whatever remained of the Roman Empire all the way until 1453. 1,000 years it remained the capital of what was left of the Roman Empire. Historians will usually call this period the Byzantine Empire to sort of separate it. But at the time of Constantinople, he simply said, the Roman Empire will be in two parts, the West and the East. There will be an administration in the West and an administration in the East. Now, the East was the richest part. It had the best agriculture, it had the best infrastructure, it had the remnants of Greek ruins and Greek Empire. And it was much closer to the trade routes with Persia and into Asia. The West was far removed, and it took a long time for boats to get back and forth. So Constantine might have made a very good real estate decision when he chose to move the city. But what it did is it created a power vacuum in the West. And as we all know, nature abhors a vacuum. And so it was logical that something was going to fill in that vacuum. When we talk about the reaction of the church to all of this, I need to back up just a little bit to remind Western Christians, such as most of us are. Now, George, your friend in Moscow, he's going to be there in the middle of the Eastern Church, so he might be much more aware of this than we are. But before there was Constantinople, there were already 3 major patriarchates ruling over the Christians of the world. Rome was one, because it had been the place where St. Peter had come and started his church. But Antioch was also considered an equal patriarchate to Rome. Antioch was, as we have in the book of Acts, a city where there was a great Christian activity very, very early. And the third ancient patriarchate was Alexandria in Egypt. And that, of course, is the place associated with St. Mark and his missionary travels. 2 later patriarchates would be established, but they came after the shift to the east. And one was in Jerusalem, which by 451 had already developed its own patriarchate. And then Constantinople became a patriarchate somewhere in the late 4th century, maybe the 380s. These 5 cities were all considered equally important in the governance of the church. And though it seems strange to us, because most of our consciousness as Western Christians has always been on the Roman patriarch. We would say the papacy, but papa is a term that all 5 of the patriarchs used. They were all rightly called popes. But they don't exist anymore. And so Rome is the only one that has left. And why did they not exist? Well, that's a topic for another of these discussion groups when we get into the rise of Islam. You'll note Alexandria, Jerusalem, Antioch, and Constantinople are all cities which ultimately were conquered by Muslim armies. Rome alone survived, and so we think of Christianity as being Rome-centered. But the action was to shift to the east. The reaction was to try to fill the void. And prior to Constantine, as I said, the church was virtually illegal. If it was organized loosely. But when Constantine moved, the church moved in. Every building we have in Western Europe that you call an ancient basilica, they were not built to be church buildings. They were built to be imperial courts, courthouses, the big room where the emperor, when traveling around, would hold court and all of the officials would come in. And he gave permission for the imperial basilicas to become places of worship because he wanted the church to be able to fill in the void that the Roman civil society had previously held. We see a shift from Roman civil law to ecclesiastical law. We see a shift from schooling on a secular basis to schooling only in religious places. And we also see the development of something that we all take for granted now, what's known as the parochial structure. You know, everything that has a parish boundary, you know, and in Europe, there's much stricter. In America, we were already organizing ourselves as independent congregations without boundary. But the parochial system were the actual political units where there would be a governor, and then the governors sort of faded in influence when Rome went to the east, and the bishop of that same political unit took over so that dioceses and parishes replaced the structure of Roman civil society. For those of us who are Anglicans, the effect of moving to the east also had a very tangible effect. And that's because as they influence and the power moved to the east, so did the armies. And so we have like the Brits taking over Britain from the Romans abandoning the British Isles, and the withdrawal from Britain starting around 383, totally completed by 410. You'll notice these dates are very much about when Constantinople is finished as a city. And so the British are no longer under Roman control. The Italians are losing the control of the emperor, the Gauls, the Iberia, and of course, the German territories, which had for a short time been under Roman control. All of them found that the armies were not there to stop them anymore from becoming sort of their own independent cultures. And of course, it was an open invitation to all what we falsely call the barbarians who were coming in, the Goths, the Visigoths, the Huns, the Alemanni, you know, all of the different groups that came in. They could take over. The church reacted by saying, if we can't fight them, maybe we should convert them. And during this time of shifting power to the east, we find the first great missionary efforts of the Western church. Prior to this time, and it's actually an academic topic of some discussion, but it was the case, generally speaking, that the Christianity developed within the Roman Empire, and there wasn't really a concept that the Roman Christians should take their Christianity outside the Roman Empire. They didn't take it into the non-Romanized areas. In fact, when we talk about Armenia being the oldest Christian kingdom in the world, it exists because it wasn't in the Roman Empire, but it had its own independent founding. The Romans didn't send missionaries into Persia. They didn't send missionaries up into Central Asia or into Northern Europe. They didn't even send missionaries across the Danube and across the Limes line. If you were in the Roman Empire, then you had access to Christianity. And if you were outside the Roman Empire, there wasn't really that much concern about you. Now, this may have just been the puberty of Christianity, and moving the power to the east left them unprepared, and they had to grow up quickly and realize it's much easier to make someone your friend than it is to defeat them as an enemy. And so in this period following the shift to the east, we see great missionary efforts being made in the west. We see a very good example is St. Patrick going to Ireland. The Irish had never been under Roman rule. And St. Patrick, who was a Britanno-Celtic Romano, some kind of ethnic group that it's hard to display. He wasn't Irish anyway. He was from Cornwall or Devon or someplace in Western England. And he went to Ireland specifically to try to convert them. And from the followers of that, we have St. Columba going up into Scotland. We have St. Willibrord leaving Devon and coming over to Friesland. We have St. Boniface coming into central Germany. We have St. Kilian going to Würzburg. And through the 4th, the 5th, the 6th centuries, we see a lot of activity as the church tries to domesticate those parts of Europe which had been abandoned by the Roman civilizing influence. One of the great conversion stories, now it's a little bit later, but I like it very much just because I enjoy the names. There was Clovis, who was the king of the Franks, when they had crossed at the Frankfurt and they moved over into what's now France, named after them. The Frankish people were on the move and they were entering back into what's Gaul. And they were not very friendly to the local inhabitants. And there was a missionary effort made to convert the Franks into Christianity, thinking that they would be easier to live with and they could develop a common value system. A great saint of the church, who goes by 2 different names depending on your mother tongue, successfully converted Clovis. In the Latinized form, we call him Saint Remigius, but in the French form, it's Saint Remy. And I think about him often when I'm talking to our own Remy at Church of the Ascension. But Saint Remy, or Saint Remigius, went right into the court of Clovis and said, "I have come to make you a Christian." And he talked to him and he converted him and he showed him the scriptures, and he successfully converted Clovis, king of the Franks. And so Clovis, in a typically barbarian authoritarian mode, said, "Good, I will be baptized and all my people as well." Well, there were thousands of Franks, and they didn't have a chance to make their own personal commitment to the Lord Jesus Christ, I think, at that point. They were just ordered, "You're all getting baptized." And Remigius, I'm sure he said, "Oh, where do we find a font big enough for this?" Well, there was a river, and they lined all the Franks up on one side. Remigius blessed the water of the river, and they all marched through as Moses leading the children of Egypt out of into the promised land through the Red Sea. Now, these stories and legends, they've all been enhanced because every time we tell it, it becomes a bigger and better and more interesting story. And I'm not really claiming to be a scholar on how Remy liturgically affected the baptism of the whole tribe of Franks, but it was said to have been all in one fell swoop. They all became Christians. There was a lot of Sunday school left to give them so they could learn what it means to be a Christian. But that Frankish Christianity, of course, ultimately resulted in Karl der Große, if you're German, or Charlemagne, if you're French, or Charlemagne, if you're American. I'm not sure why the British have never called him Charles the Great, except that you have controversy about kings named Charles and whether or not they're great or not. But Charlemagne had his capital at Aix-la-Chapelle in what's now Germany, Aachen, and that was the center of the Frankish Empire. So the West reacted by filling the vacuum, filling the void by bringing in structure, by bringing in Christianized civilization. And it was different than the way the church developed in the East. The Western church stayed with Latin as its liturgical language. The Eastern church stayed with Greek. The Eastern church kept Roman architecture because Constantinople was still there as a Roman influence. And so the Eastern churches almost always have the rounded Romanesque windows, whereas in the West there was a greater freedom, and it ultimately ended up with what we now think of as Gothic architecture, vastly different. Western Europe and Eastern Europe had even a greater divide when Saints Cyril and Methodius, assisting as missionaries in the Eastern Empire, developed the Cyrillic alphabet so that Slavic languages could have the Bible translated into Slavic. So it's this visible difference we see even now when we try to travel in the East and we say, oh, I can't even read the alphabet, you know, and that also can be said to have been a result. The impact of Rome moving to Constantinople had impact in art, architecture, church structure, church government, church music, the liturgy, and the feeling of we're far off, we can do what we want. The tragedy of this came at the Council of Toledo in Spain, and I think that I'm going to say it's in the 8th century. Somebody here will know me better, but it was at that council when, so far removed from the patriarchs of the East, the Council of Toledo added a few little words into the Nicene Creed. It's what we call the filioque clause. And it still is a burr under the saddle of the church even now, stopping us from ecumenical work, because every time we try to work together with the Christians of the East, they always raise the issue of the filioque clause. How can you have put that in without asking us to be part of the decision? The divide between the East and the West solidified itself in the year 1000 when the Pope excommunicated everybody who was a follower of the Patriarch of Constantinople, and the Patriarch of Constantinople excommunicated everybody who was a follower of the Pope. So technically, we're all going to hell one way or the other. That wound traces itself back to bad infrastructure in the city of Rome. If they had just cleaned the sewers better, Constantinople might never have been built. And maybe the church could be more united. We're going to see in a future episode how the impact of the Muslim invasions in the 8th century, how it added to the division. But for the point today, I would like to conclude here in just a moment with the idea that nature abhors a vacuum. And this is not only physics, it also works with structure, of the social structure even now. The Roman Christians said, we will fill that vacuum by codifying church laws, by setting boundaries, by strengthening rights that are to be followed, to take away the optional local usage. And it was like, in order to fill the vacuum, we must become stronger and more institutionalized. And I think that there's a spiritual truth that we can see even when we look around the world today, where there are places turning to authoritarianism and structural strength. And one says, why would they do that? And almost always it's because we can find something that has threatened their sense of stability. And it's a reaction of fear, whether it be immigrants, whether it be impoverishment, whether it be economic collapse. You know, in times of great fear, in times of great distress, this nature abhors the vacuum thing almost always rears its head with authoritarianism, strength as a tool for conviction, and hardly ever does good come out of all of this. But when we realize that we're not dealing with strength, we're dealing with fear, then we as Christians have a whole different pastoral approach that we need to be taking. I'll just be real honest, when I'm living in Texas, my friends and neighbors have for several years been very, very adamant Trump supporters. And I don't really want to argue politics with them. You know, I'm not going to convince them, because it wasn't a logical decision. It was a fear-based decision. And so I find myself much more entering into discussions with them like, well, what are you afraid of? And they'll say, what's that got to do with it? You know, what is it that shakes your foundation? What is it that makes you think strength and might is the will of God or the way of God? So the action was the shifting of power from the west to the east. The reaction was the development of a whole new way of doing church. We're no longer in the house church, in the atrium. We're now in the basilica with imperial rights and strong bishops.